Fellow for the Council on Foreign Relations, discusses the making of the modern world and the establishment of Britain and America as global powers. His talk from New York City is about an hour.
Welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations and to tonight's meeting to celebrate or discuss, or both, maybe to criticize, Walter Russell Mead's most recent book. Title is God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World. My name is Richard Haas. I'm president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and lucky enough to have this opportunity to talk to Walter for a few minutes about his book, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you to ask all the good questions that I wasn't smart enough to ask him. Let me start off with some praise for the book. I think it's only fair to praise people before we... Walter Isaacson calls this a sweeping and compelling book. George Will describes it as scintillating. And Fareed Zakaria calls it fascinating and thought-provoking. And even in the world of hyperbole that is blurbdom, not bad. Not bad. Let's start with the title, Walter. God and Gold. The last time I heard those two words, it was part of three words, God, Glory, and Gold, and the Crusades. And I assume that having God and Gold in the title was not accidental.
Well, that's right. Because this is really a book about how some religious attitudes and attitudes toward capitalism have helped power the Anglo-Americans to this sort of unique position in world history over the last 300 years.
Well, let's dig down a bit. A lot of this book is about the world that the Anglo-Americans have wrought. Let's talk about the cardinal features of this world. What is this Anglo-American world?
Well, I call it the maritime system in the book, which is to say it's a system that is built on trade, on commerce. We really look at it, what the English and the Americans, and by the way, the Dutch invented this before the British and the Americans put it together. But it's an open society at home that's democratic, that has economic freedom, that is tolerant of religious and various other kinds of unorthodoxies. So there's a very creative society that is developing new ways to make products, new ways to think about the world, new ways to finance companies. You then, in a sense, you take that show on the road. You go out there, you trade with the rest of the world, you engage with the rest of the world, and that trade makes you wealthy enough to provide sort of a naval strategy that protects your key sea lanes, that allows you to maintain a balance of strategy, a balance of power in key theaters of the world. You then build this network, this global network of trade and economics and finance. You invite other countries into the system. And you promote liberal values around the world so that other countries become more capable of succeeding in this system, but also, in a sense, more friendly to it, more useful to it. And that system, a balance of power, trade, global organization, and an open society has really, that system has been the kind of key feature, I think, of international power relations for the last 300 years.
Let me just challenge it in one area because it's not obvious to me. If I look at the last century, you had the rise of Imperial Germany early in the century. You then had the rise of Nazi Germany as well as Fascist Italy and Imperial Japan, and then you had 4 decades of Cold War. So how would one say that the last century was an example of Anglo-American dominance?
Well, one would be the fact, who won all those wars? World War I, World War II. And this is really comparable to the 18th century when the British were building the system. Sometimes people call the period between about 1688 and 1815, the final defeat of Napoleon, the Second Hundred Years' War. Because most of the time in that period, the British were fighting the French. And as it happened again in the 18th century, again in the 20th century, the Anglo-Americans win these struggles. So it's not a kind of an effortless supremacy that no one resists, but it's a contested supremacy. And the question is partly, how is it that the British and the Americans were able to do so well?
How is it that the Americans and the British were able to do so well?
It is, you know, a lot of it, again, I think a lot of it has to do with this sea power strategy is superior, and once you've established a global order like this, it's very hard to lose it. So that once the British defeated the French in North America and in Asia in the 7 Years' War, they were able to really set up a way of organizing the world that lasted until the Second World War. And the only, you know, the British could lose to Napoleon over and over again in Europe, but they still had their global position. So once you've established this kind of global system, it takes a kind of a coordinated, simultaneous attack to destroy it. But I think another reason is that precisely because capitalism is the center of the system, the way the system works, that both the British and the Americans stayed on the technological and financial edge, so that they had capabilities, they had technology, they had financial abilities that allowed them to defeat these rivals over this very long period.
You emphasized when I first asked one of the first questions the role of trade. So let me return to that in a slightly different way. How much of this is a voluntary system, and how much of this is essentially a coercive system? What is the balance, if you will, between countries wanting to be a part of it and countries essentially being forced to be a part of this world?
Well, I've used the concept of sticky power to describe this kind of a system. That is, the Anglo-American system of global trade. You know, after World War II, we said to Germany and Japan, you don't have to fight us anymore. If you fight us, we'll beat you. But you don't have to do that. But you can be as rich as you can make yourselves. You can trade freely. You can use the whole international system for yourself. And so that's very attractive. It's what we're doing, I think, to a large degree with China today, is saying, knock yourselves out, get rich, invest, trade, become a major power through participation in this system. But then what happens is once your economy has grown dependent over decades of this global integration, to suddenly lose resources that come from overseas or lose international markets that you've become dependent on is a severe shock. So there are elements of both voluntarism and elements of compulsion in it. It's sort of it's a set of incentives and disincentives, I suppose.
This sounds in some ways reminiscent of some other ideas historically. One is when Henry Kissinger talked about détente. Part of it was to try to hook, at that time, the Soviet Union on certain of the advantages of participation in the system, so they would therefore be less inclined to throw it over.
All right. And I think the difficulty we always had at working with the Soviet Union was that economics, which is the heart, capitalist economics, which is really the core of what we do and the core in the sense of what makes our system attractive, had very, very limited appeal in the Soviet Union. They had, even Russia today, in a sense, has less ability to prosper in this than some other countries do. So for the system to work, for you to really get other countries to want to buy in and be part of it, they need to be able to benefit from a capitalist system of exchange.
Lots of questions come to mind, so let me ask some of them. In order for them to buy into this system, they have to be allowed to. And that assumes that we want them to become full participants in this global capitalist open economic system. That would seem to me to largely rule out protectionism. How much is your thinking in some ways threatened not by military force overturning it, but rather the growing reluctance of this society and others to essentially let others in, particularly when it turns out they're pretty good at it too?
Yeah, I think that is a real question, and the British also faced issues over free trade versus protection at various stages in their custodianship of the system. I guess I'd have to say that this system is somewhat fault tolerant, that over the years we've had maybe a spectacular example of fault tolerance in some recent years. But the system, you don't have to operate it perfectly or 100% to get benefits. So yes, there is resistance today to extending free trade. On the other hand, what's already institutionalized in terms of global free trade is far greater than we had, say, at the end of World War II. So I hope, and I think our system will benefit, I think to the degree that countries like China, that developing countries, especially in the third world who want to export more agricultural goods to the developed world, I think if we can make our system more attractive to those, we will gain tremendously in terms of a world that is more peaceful and more stable, a world where countries are more accepting of the international system and of America's role in it. We need to do that, and I hope we continue to, but we don't have to get 100% in order to still have a system that's a workable one.
So imagine that the Doha round of trade talks never pick up, and that the current WTO system is about as far as we get for the next generation. We can live with that.
And I don't think we fully can, but I think what you already see people falling back on the second best strategy, which is the proliferation of bilateral and regional trade deals. So I think the truth is that actually America's national interests, our own prosperity, is so bound up in free trade that even when there's some political resistance to it, we find ways to still move ahead, because people have often said it's very easy for Congress in the abstract to vote against, say, a trade promotion authority or that, but when you have a specific trade deal which has been negotiated in such a way as it creates a lot of winners in the United States, it's much harder for Congress to reject specific deals. I think we're going to be going through, particularly if we have a Democratic administration next time and the Democratic majorities in Congress continue, we're going to go through some very tough conversations about trade. But, you know, the Clinton administration, the first Clinton administration, did a pretty good job advancing a free trade agenda, and I think the forces in the Democratic Party that support free trade remain strong.
You used the word liberal before, and I assume you're using it in the classic sense, not in the contemporary sense. What is it you're trying to say there? That it's inevitable that if we have this world order that you describe, that participants in it, their societies will gradually become more open politically and economically, or simply that it's desirable that happen as well? What's the connection here between the sort of global order that you're talking about and the domestic nature of other societies?
Right. Well, I think there are, in the book I talk about two kinds of history. The universal history, you know, that sort of says this is the end of history, this liberal, utopian world of free trade and free societies. But then there's also cultural history, particular history, that some countries, some cultures don't like this capitalist liberal system as much as others do, or have a harder time. You know, it's not a game they're either good at playing or want to play. So I think what you're going to see for the foreseeable future is continued resistance to this system from cultures that either don't like the system as a whole, or find it doesn't suit their needs, or don't like the role they see for themselves in the system. But the reality is that cultures they don't all need to be like us, and I don't think the world will ever all be one way, or you know, that we're going to replace the diversity of cultures that exist. But cultures do have to learn how to master the challenge of capitalism one way or another. You know, in the 19th century, Japan and China both faced this problem of this aggressive capitalist system and the power that European countries had because they had adopted the system and were working in it. The Japanese were able to figure out a way to play that game and succeed. The Chinese were not in the 19th century, and so China in the 19th century was humiliated, it was weak, it was dissatisfied. You know, today obviously China has learned, but we can look around the world and see places maybe today that are where China was 100 years ago and simply cannot master these forces. And just as you had episodes like the Boxer Rebellion and a lot of anti-foreign feeling in China 100 years ago, I think you see some of that taking place in other parts of the world today.
This is a big book, figuratively and literally, and it brings to mind three other big books. And I say this not to flatter you, that I'm not above flattering you, but it does raise questions with all three, and they're in some ways three of the more influential books of the last 10 or 15 years. And it clearly is inconsistent or is a challenge to two of them. And let me begin. One is Paul Kennedy's book. Paul Kennedy wrote a big book about essentially the rise and fall of great powers throughout history. And one way of trying to associate his book with yours, he would say, even if you're right, and there is something called this Anglo-American world order, now largely supported or buttressed by America and the U.S. role in the world, that the history of great powers is to overreach. The process of overreach undermines the foundations of their power that made it possible for them to be influential in the first place, and it will come to an end. At some point, does the historical temptation to overreach undermine the United States, and in the process undermine this Anglo-American world order that you described?
I think, well, obviously nothing can be ruled out, and the future is a very long period. You know,
that's on the record, by the way, that last question.
You know, I don't want to be too definitive here when I say that.
Yes.
But I will say that actually Paul has blurbed the UK version of the book, of this book, and I think where Paul sees connections between what the two of us are talking about is, first of all, there is this question of timing. If you were to say in the abstract, here's a process that causes great powers to fall, you look and you realize, well, the Roman Empire lasted 1,400 years, or various Chinese dynasties lasted a century. So even if there is a process that can be identified about empires, it doesn't necessarily mean that that explains what's happening in the news this week. But I think at a deeper level, I think Paul and I are both very interested in the dynamism of American society. That is to say, you know, how economically creative are we? How, as a people, do we remain risk-taking? Do we sort of have this cluster of values that helped make the British and the American great? And as long as that heart of the system, so to speak, is still strong, then overreach is more difficult. But you could reach a point where we lost our internal dynamism, the way perhaps happened in the UK in a lot of the 20th century. And at that point, commitments that seem to be necessary and to work might suddenly become overextension, or that overextension would be more damaging if you lack the resilience and the ability to recover. I think that's probably where I would take that.
The second challenge, it would seem to me, would come from Sam Huntington, who, as everybody knows, first wrote his Clash of Civilizations piece in Foreign Affairs, our magazine, then published it in a book. And I think if Sam were here tonight, what he would pose is a question to the basic, what's the word, willingness to accept on the part of others. And what he would do is look at other civilizations, as he called them, and would say it's all but inevitable that this Anglo-American world order, with certain values, certain countries and societies get advantage more than others, will one way or another annoy or alienate or be seen as a threat by others, and they will push back.
Well, first of all, I would agree with that and point out that the history of the last 300 years has been, this is one long clash of civilizations, in the sense that you had the fight of the English in the 17th century with the Catholic Empire of Spain, where people both thought it was a religious conflict as well as a conflict over colonies and so on. You then had a very similar conflict with absolutist France. And again, you go back and you read what the English were saying at the time as a fight for Protestantism and liberty against Catholic absolutism. And there was a real sense in France of a culture clash. You look at what the Germans were saying leading up to World War I about the difference between, you know, German culture with its deep soul and its sense of human feeling and solidarity, and this cold, implacable, hypocritical English style. I mean, we don't need to go into what the communists and the Nazis were saying. So, in many ways, if you read what bin Laden has said, for example, about the United States, you can actually find echoes of that in what some of Napoleon's propagandists were saying about Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. just as you can find that the Brits in 1810 were saying some of the same kinds of things about the Napoleonic Empire that Reagan said about the Cold War. There is this sense of a clash between this culture of individualism, freedom, and risk-taking, and human societies throughout the world which put a higher value on stability, tradition, on group solidarity. So I think, for example, what you see in parts of the Middle East today and with some elements of the Muslim world and the U.S. is sort of the latest installment of a very long saga.
Well, I was going to mention it, but you did, so let's just stick with it for a minute. That seems to me to be a relatively big challenge. You've got, what, 1.2 billion, give or take, people in the world who are Muslims. One of the questions I think that people would pose to you is the complementarity, I suppose, of the values, the precepts of Islam and societies that are predominantly Muslim and an Anglo-American world order. Questions about individualism, questions about secularism, and so forth, whether there isn't some sort of fundamental clash.
Well, this is the kind of thing that, again, since only the future can tell us, because as Muslims think about their relationship with the Anglo-American world, you get attitudes that range from sort of total rejection in the hills of Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda. On the other hand, you have these people in Dubai and places who are developing, how can we do Islamic finance that can do everything that the capitalist system does, but does it in harmony with Islamic law? So that, in other words, how do we make this dynamism available in our own society and in our own terms? My guess is that over time, probably that second approach will be more successful, but you don't know. Again, though, if you look back at the past, people once thought that the division between Catholicism and liberal society was every bit as deep as people now think the gap between Islam and Anglo-American society is. I mean, you think of the first great act of mass religious terror when Guy Fawkes and a group of radical Catholics tried to blow up the House of Parliament with the King and the House of Lords and the House of Commons in there. You look at popes placed the writings of John Locke, the writings of Adam Smith on the index of prohibited books, because they said this separation of church and state is a violation of basic Christian doctrine. So you can find, even in American history, as late as 1927, the Supreme Court of the state of Pennsylvania affirmed that the truth and the divine origin of the Christian religion are part of the common law of Pennsylvania. And they cited as a precedent an 1844 U.S. Supreme Court case that was argued by Daniel Webster. So the idea, when in the first law codes of Massachusetts in the colonial era, they gave the biblical citation by each one of their criminal laws. The colony of New Haven adopted unanimously a resolution that the Bible shall be the only basis of law in this colony. So a lot of attitudes that we are seeing in the Islamic world today, and everybody's going, oh, this just shows that those people can never learn our system or never be part of it, or there's a fundamental hostility between Islam and the way we live, are just not looking at the way our own values have evolved in our own history.
What about nationalism? I would think that you're basically articulating a form of internationalism. I've called it integration in another content, my last book. Others have written about it. And there's a sense of almost inevitability is too strong, but there's a logic to what you're arguing. Economic and other linkages, creating vested interests and not being what Henry Kissinger called in another context, a revolutionary power. What about the nationalism, the pushback, whether we're seeing elements of it now in Russia, we're seeing it obviously in places like Venezuela, empowered by resources. Right. We're seeing it in China. In some ways, the most powerful ideology in China today is arguably not communism. It may be consumerism, or it may be nationalism. We're obviously seeing forms of nationalism still in the Middle East. you're basically writing a version of internationalism. Why are you confident, if you will, that it can succeed against nationalism?
Right. Well, again, I'm not trying to say that I don't think there's going to be crises in the future. You know, this is not a book that says the big struggles are behind us. Because as far as I can see, you know, we could well have a 21st century that was, you know, as violent and chaotic as the 20th. Again, looking at the history of this Anglo-American system, we see that it's been unusual for it to be at peace. The Cold War or long wars are a much more normal situation. So I don't see us closing out all of the other kinds of possibilities. And I very much think that some of the nationalism in Russia or in some other places could cause very dangerous and very costly kinds of crises going into the future. So this is not a recipe for complacency. I do think that over time there are good reasons why, for example, China is going to find it more in China's national interest, even China's nationalist interest, to be a supportive part of this system. And part of that is that I think it's very likely we will see a balance of power taking shape in Asia. China isn't the only country growing there. There's also India. There will be 2 nuclear superpowers in Asia that each have 1 billion people or more in them. And there are a lot of other smaller but very significant powers growing in Asia. So if you add from a Chinese perspective, you add the advantages that they get by participating in an international economic system that works very well for them, and the fact that in some ways the road to nationalistic assertion is closed not so much by American policy as by the geography and the demographics of Asia itself, then yes, could China challenge the system? You know, well, Germany made a mistake. Germany should have calculated in 1914 that it was better for it to stay in a kind of a peaceful system. It didn't. People make mistakes. And we can make mistakes as well, I think, in making it more difficult for other people to do the right thing than necessary.
I have 2 last questions, then I'll open it up. How important are institutions in your system? Everyone thinks of the UN as a leading international institution. How much of this, the primacy of this Anglo-American world order, requires institutional support, or does it simply work pretty well in the absence of anything that formal?
I think the Anglo-American system has always been a creator of institutions. That is, institutions are part of the system, but there's also been a certain hesitancy and unwillingness to let institutions limit one's freedom of action. So the British very much wanted to have an international system after the fall of Napoleon, but they very quickly, they were some of the first to want to limit what the Holy Alliance did and didn't do. So there's been a certain ambivalence all along there. My guess would be that the place for real creativity, the UN certainly has a role and will continue to have one, but I think it is more important or more helpful in some ways to really work on strengthening some key regional institutions. That regional institutions can often, the world today is getting more different. The third world used to be almost one thing, a lot of countries in more or less the same situation. But if you look at Latin America, East Asia, South Asia, Africa today, they're so far apart that really maybe each of them benefits more from institutions. But also this business of nationalism and wanting your culture to be respected and wanting to be, in a sense, governed in ways that accord with your own feelings and culture, that can often work better in a regional institution where a set of common cultural assumptions and historical experience guides the way things interact. So, the European Union is obviously the great success for this, but ASEAN, I think, has also been more effective than many people ever thought it would be.
One last question before we open it up. Imagine we are successful in persuading Condoleezza Rice or President Bush or others who are senior in the U.S. administration, whoever the next occupants of these offices are, to read this book. or maybe we don't have to persuade them. They simply come to that insight by themselves. What is the relevance of this for day-to-day policy? Let's take it down from 36,000 feet to sea level. If they said, I like this idea, what is it then they do the next morning when they show up at the office that might be different than what they're doing today?
There's a phrase I talk about in the book, and I think is very important because it kind of, in a way, it helps mediate this I think, in a sense, conflict between the Huntington clash position and the Fukuyama end of history. And again, I end up saying I think they're both true. I think we've got both, an end of history and clashes of civilizations.
It's called hedging your bets, Walter.
I prefer to think of it as a synthesis, a Hegelian synthesis. I talk about the diplomacy of civilization. That is to say, to understand how how it is difficult for people in, say, the Arab world to be comfortable with this kind of, a system that right now doesn't offer them many political benefits, economic benefits, not much benefits in terms of liberty, a sense of humiliation in some ways. Its cultural assumptions run counter. Well, this probably means, for example, that just knocking off one particular dictator in one country isn't going to make them like you in some fundamental way. That actually it's a very complex process. And furthermore, you'd be much more aware of the way that when people look at you, they don't just see the statement that you made on television the day before, but they see a very long historical process. Then they see you as the latest actor in a drama that began before you were born and will go on after you're dead. And your diplomacy with them, your way of interacting with these countries, needs to take that into account.
Well, let me push it up. For example, if one said that this Anglo-American order is an important thing, it obviously serves our interests, and we, the United States, have to be awfully careful about seeing dynamics gain strength, that would threaten it.
Right.
Does that, therefore, would that have arguments? Let me throw out some hypotheses. Give you a few. One is that the United States ought not to allow Iran to have nuclear weapons because that could lead to a chain of proliferation which could have dramatic consequences for regional and world order. Does that argue against the United States simply picking up and leaving Iraq because of the perceptions that the United States was giving up on order? Does that lead to a much greater push towards a Doha round trade agreement? And does this have real policy consequences? Well, maybe the three I mentioned are wrong, but does it have real consequences?
Well, I think it would certainly. One thing it would do, I think, is it does say, look, the Middle East is a central issue for the Anglo-American system. And again, it's not. I think people often get the importance of oil to American foreign policy wrong. They think of us as kind of Dracula roaming the world in search of nubile young virgins to suck dry of their bodily fluids and then move on to the next. And people think of American oil policy as trying to sink the fangs into something. And
first time I've heard that, but we'll entertain that.
It's and in reality, we are actually far less dependent on Middle Eastern oil than any other major economic region of the world. And if you look in the future as to where we see our oil and energy coming from, the Middle East is not playing a larger and larger role for us. Instead, for us, the importance of oil in the Middle East is a big issue that involves, for example, the fact that for our world system to work, Japan needs to feel that if it needs to buy oil, it can go to the Middle East cash in hand and buy as much oil at the prevailing prices it thinks it wants, and furthermore that oil will then get there to Japan, that the sea traffic won't be interrupted, that no one is going to sort of hijack the oil market for some political end. If Japan didn't feel that the American system, the Pax Americana, provided that kind of security, Japan would have much more need, in effect, to build intercontinental military forces that could provide it for its own vital security. The same would be true of India, the same would be true of China, of Europe. You'd start seeing this much more great power political and military competition in the Middle East and in the sea lanes, because obviously every ship that Japan builds to protect a Japanese tanker would look to China like a ship built to threaten a Chinese tanker. So the race would go forward.
That's all much more likely to happen for American underreach than American overreach.
Well, that's what I'm saying, that in fact this analysis would lead you to a forward policy in the Middle East. Now, a big analysis like this isn't going to tell you whether necessarily this war or that war is the thing to do, or whether you should recognize this one or not recognize that one. But this will tell you you cannot walk away from the Middle East. And you also would have to view very seriously anything that portended to change the balance of power in the Middle East. An Iranian nuclear weapon under this analysis would be something that would be of the gravest possible concern to you.
Okay, I've gone on too long. Let me remind you, this is on the record. If you raise your hand, I'll do my best to call on you. Wait for microphone. Please introduce yourself, and please keep your question as brief as you can so we can get as many questions in as we like. Kim.
Kim Davis from Charles Bank Capital. Could you talk about the Ottoman Empire, which I think you could describe as maritime and tolerant? Is it a predecessor to God and Gold, or is there a discontinuity because of the Industrial Revolution?
The Ottoman Empire?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually would think of the Ottoman Empire as being much more of a land power than, I mean, yes, it had forces, but it was much less about sea power. If you were going to look at that era, I'd look at Venice and Genoa as much more comparable.
What's the Let me ask Kim's last question in a slightly different way. The Ottoman Empire lasted, what, 4 centuries, give or take? What, if any, lessons are there for the United States right now?
From the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah. Either from the fact that it lasted as long as it did, or from the fact that it ended.
Well, I think let's look at, why did it end? And I think it was at some key places along their history. The Ottomans became very smug and self-sufficient. They didn't think they had to learn anything from other people. So when they came in with these printing presses from Europe, they said, well, we don't need that. That's kind of dangerous. Anyway, so let's not do this. Let's not go through this kind of revolution. And what happened is that the Chinese, by the way, had the same problem. They felt that they didn't need to learn from other people. Now, it seems to me that in some ways the essence of a maritime system is engagement with the rest of the world. Being involved commercially, economically, socially, culturally, and learning from the best that's out there. So in that sense, very much, I see important lessons for us.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Marta Varela, Hunter College. I wanted to ask you, Walter, environmental concerns, either perceived environmental problems or actual evidence of environmental degradation. How does that affect your theory with respect to the mercantilism, the untrammeled aspects of what you call WASP capitalism?
Well, I think what we're seeing, and not just because of pollution or even global warming, but for a whole series of factors, are, I think, driving the world economy away from sort of metal bashing and heavy object moving and manipulation and energy-intensive applications. And that the economy of the future, we're seeing that the role that energy, oil plays per unit of U.S. GDP has been shrinking pretty steadily since the 1970s. I think this is going to be happening in a lot of places, and that the movement of the world system is going to be away from this, partly because I think we will adopt some policies about pollution. And again, the stress here, it seems to me, has got to be on the creativity of a system which can hunt for answers, and then when answers are discovered, apply them and develop effective ways of inserting them into the social system. I want to say maybe very quickly, too, that in the book, I don't argue that the U.S. or Britain have triumphed because they were purely laissez-faire. In fact, what I've said is that they've had an ability to have incredibly intense competition, but also rules and clear regulators as well. They've managed to mix it. It's very interesting. Almost every sport that's played today around the world was developed is played under rules that were developed in either Britain or the U.S. mostly in the 19th century. And the idea in developing, whether it's the Marquis of Queensberry rules in boxing, or the tennis rules, or soccer, any of these, they wanted a combination. They wanted rules, but they wanted the rules not to suppress competition, but in order to have the keenest possible competition. And it seems, and so this idea that rules and competition are somehow antithetical is not really part of this Anglo-American genius. And so I would say applying some of that vision to the environment of, yeah, we want a healthy economy, we want a clean environment, we will need some regulations. How do we do this in a sensible, minimalist way, and if possible in a way that stimulates the economy rather than suppressing it, is probably the way we need to go.
Clearly lots of hands. Jim Zirin.
Jim Zirin. Walter, I think I heard you suggest in this room not too long ago that Christian religion requires the separation of church and state, and I guess the citation might be, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's and unto God what's God's. And tonight you seem to say that others believe that the separation of church and state is antithetical to Christian religion. And I wondered which you thought was the true belief.
Okay, well, if you ask me sort of an essential, not having actually been ordained into the ministry of any faith or given a gift of infallibility of any kind, I'm actually not able to tell you, sort of lay down the law on what the essence of Christian revelation is in an authoritative way. But my sense is that most American Christians today, Protestant or Catholic, have come to believe that the separation of church and state actually fulfills their deepest view of Christian values. However, if you look at the history of both Protestantism and capitalism, you will find this is not the way people have thought for many centuries. And so that the view of Christians themselves about what is the proper relationship of church and state is something that has evolved or changed. Maybe I shouldn't use the word evolved in this context, but changed through history. And I suppose I'm suggesting that if Christians have gone through this process of change, I'm not quite sure why Muslims wouldn't also have changes. And if you look at Islamic history, there actually have been a number of different views over the centuries about some of these issues.
The question, though, of religion raises another point, which is Britain is an overwhelmingly Christian country. The United States is largely a Christian country. How much of this foreign policy that has emerged from the two, if you will, reflects ideas that are to be found in contemporary Christianity?
Yeah. I think, well, Britain certainly was once an overwhelmingly Christian country. I'm not sure that they would claim that today, but or think it was a claim. I think it was a charge, an allegation. But I think I do think that one of the reasons for these persistent clashes between civilizations is the degree to which our system does embody sort of institutions and ways of thought and values that are rooted in Christianity quite specifically. Certainly in our country, our whole idea of the separation of church and state really emerges from sort of 18th century Baptist theology in many ways. And the Southern Baptist Convention has for much of our history been one of the staunchest voices in support of a separation of church and state. So, so I don't think it's at all surprising that people in a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Muslim or a Jewish country with a different set of backgrounds might find some things that we take for granted and seem like complete common sense to be rather strange. Now, what we have, I think, progressively tried to do, and it's partly because in America we have so many different Christian groups that we're always trying to look for the common denominator. Okay, well, Methodists and Baptists disagree about these things, so let's put them aside, but we all agree on some civic project or something we can do together, so let's do that. So we have gradually developed this ability to remain faithful to our own personal faith traditions and also identify more areas of commonality. One would hope that in the world today, because many people are now for the first time interacting in a world with a lot of religious and cultural diversity. 50 years ago, people were, in a sense, in their own cultures in a lot of the world, and maybe didn't meet that many people whose beliefs were fundamentally different from theirs. In many ways, the world society as a whole is now looking at what English society faced around 1700, which is a lot of different quarreling religious sects, each with a different idea of the way the world should look and the way the government should be run, and yet none of them can conquer the others or make the others go away. And so what we have to start doing is working out a way that we can all live together. And that process was very important in American history. I think in some ways at a global level, this is a process we're at the beginning of today.
One over here. Professor Stephen Grobard.
I am very taken with your idea of an Anglo-American genius. But what I miss in all your talk is what I call Anglo-American differences. A Revolutionary War, a War of 1812, a great dubiety on the part of the British about the value of the northern side in the Civil War. We owe so much to a man named Gladstone. Great dubieties at the end of the century about our policies in Latin America and elsewhere. Only in the First World War did these two rivals, and they were rivals, they weren't friends, did these two rivals join together. And then, even then, as you know, there were great dubieties, both not so much there as here, as to whether they should join together. What I'm asking is, what attention do you give to that continuing historical rivalry and difference? Because they were different societies. That is how Walter Bagehot saw it, that is how Carlyle saw it, that is how every major 19th century intellectual in Britain saw it. How do you treat those differences?
Well, I suppose I actually treat them a little bit more in the preface to the UK edition, which is coming out in November.
Coming to a bookstore near you if you live 6,000 miles from here, yes.
Grove Atlantic. You know, I mean, your points are well taken. In fact, where I do touch on this most clearly is I point out that, you know, what the British did to the Dutch in the wars against Louis XIV was that with one hand they defended the Netherlands from France, and with the other they picked the Dutch pockets. And so at the end of the French wars, the British emerged running a system that the Dutch had really started. This is very much what the United States did to the British in World War II. With one hand, we defended them from Hitler and others. With the other, we very seriously went to work deconstructing the British Empire. And Keynes used to talk about his job in trying to negotiate with the United States was to keep the United States from plucking out the eyes of the British Empire during the war. But we plucked them. And I think Roosevelt, by the way, Franklin Roosevelt, who was from an old Dutch family who came here when it was still New Amsterdam, was aware of the irony and sort of enjoyed doing to the British what they had once done to the Dutch. And very much the U.S. and the British, we haven't acted together. In a sense, we sort of only come together when someone sort of attacks us both. And Churchill talked about two peoples divided by a common language. I think you can also talk about two peoples divided by a common culture, two peoples divided by a common history.
Richard Gardner.
Walter, I'm in agreement with your central thesis, but rather surprised that you don't mention the three global institutions which are the result of Anglo-American cooperation during and immediately after the Second World War. The World Bank, the IMF, the GATT, now WTO. The amazing thing is that those institutions were essentially the product of a negotiation between two countries, the US, UK. The end of the Second World War, there were perhaps 24 members of the two. Now they're global. 170 members, I think, of the IMF, World Bank, 151 of the WTO. Question, if we wish these institutions to continue to be purveyors of this unique and valuable culture, isn't there a challenge to make their legitimacy greater? As long as the United States insists on the presidency of the World Bank, the Europeans insist on the presidency of the managing director of the IMF, and not bring in the Asians with it, recognizing the shift in the world balance of power. And Putin even suggested that the IMF managing director should be a Czech, and that was rejected. To make this viable, don't these uniquely valuable global institutions have to modernize in that way?
Well, I'm not so sure Putin would be thrilled if we'd suggested a Pole for the presidency of the IMF. A Czech might be okay, but a Pole he probably wouldn't go for. I do think, or worse yet, an Estonian, I think. But I do agree with you that these institutions need to change. And that's one of the problems with institutions. They're very hard to change. I would go further, and I look at the UN Security Council and say that, you know, it's absurd that a majority of the permanent seats in the UN Security Council go to countries that are not only European states, but are sort of retired world powers rather than active ones in some cases. And that looking at the future, one would imagine that the UN Security Council probably ought to have an EU member, the United States, India, China, and then Japan, I suppose, maybe Russia. But in any case, it's a, you know, how we can change these institutions to reflect changing conditions is a major issue that's before us. And obviously, we just can't go in and impose the changes we want. My guess is that over time, realistically, we will see a shift of institutional power in these world systems, essentially from Europe to Asia. That's one that's needed. But obviously it's going to be resisted sometimes.
I'm sure it's only a question of time before the French and the British voluntarily give up their seats to a united EU seat. And
I'm waiting for the day.
Sir, just wait for the microphone.
Sorry. Amar Bere, Columbia University. Following up on a prior question to push on the differences between the US and the UK. There are also material differences if one is to believe Alfred Chandler in the kind of capitalism between the US and the UK. That the UK system was very much, as you describe, a trade-oriented maritime system. The US was very much a system based on exploiting economies of scale and scope. And in that sense, the US capitalism had much more in common with Germany and Japan than it did have with the UK. And the UK, in that sense, had much more in common with Portugal and Holland. And following these differences, there were also differences in the kinds of ideologies and policies, which is that the UK was much more interested in free trade, the US was not. So how do you lump all these things? I mean,
well, what I say there is that, what I would say is that it's certainly true that when the US wasn't running the system and we were an emerging power within it, we had very much a sense of trying also to protect ourselves from, you know, from sort of British competition and so on, and to organize our internal market. But as Britain gradually sort of failed in the 20th century and the U.S. had to step in, what you found was we moved from being protectionist to being to free trade. The proportion of our economy that was linked with trade has risen. We've become much more global in all kinds of dimensions. So that, in a sense, what happened was the United States, under the British umbrella, developed the abilities that then, when that umbrella was gone, in a sense, allowed the United States to replace it. So I'd say there's, among other things, an issue of historical sequencing. But again, to say that Britain and America are more similar to each other, say, than most other sets of two countries would be that don't share so much common history, culture, and civilization, is by no means to say they're identical. And their histories have diverged. I think that the key divergence for me actually takes place in the 18th century when the British, under the sort of Hanoverians, moved toward, and under the pressure of the wars with France, moved toward a much more centralized, much more sort of establishment-oriented, even much more elitist kind of way. That British society looked more American in some ways in 1700 than it did in 1800. And the Americans rejected the kind of Walpole movement toward that kind of government, and were sort of like the real Whigs in the UK. So they're very different. We're still much more Cromwellian, and they're still much more Anglican in the way that they think about things. But these, it seems to me, are sort of family differences, the differences between siblings or the differences between cousins. And they're still, and it's very important, without neglecting the differences, it's very important to understand, I think, the extremely deep similarities. For example, operating under a system of common law is one of the key ones. That really has shaped a certain historical reality that's felt not only by us, but other people around the world see a great deal of resemblance between the Americans and the British, although they also see differences.
Got time for just a couple more questions. Ted Sorensen.
Walter, thank you for a very thought-provoking evening. Your thesis, I find, generally very sound, provided that the people who are running things in the United States are internationalists, understand history, are logical. The trouble is where in your book and in your general thesis does democracy come in? Electorates by nature are not always insightful, wise, logical, knowledgeable about history. They are often arbitrary and whimsical and by nature a little bit isolationist and protectionist.
Well, I agree, and as you know, because the Century Foundation very generously sponsored the book, I wrote a book in Special Providence that looked at just some of these sort of deeply rooted ideas in the population that aren't comfortable with some of these assumptions. And I think the answer that I'd give, again, as I said earlier, you don't need 100% compliance. The system is probably, fortunately for us, a little bit fault tolerant. You don't need to get 100% wisdom, 100% competence, 100% internationalism. And the reality is that, in a sense, our interests are sometimes wiser than we are as a people. That we have, we have interests, we have corporations, we have the Middle West is very concerned to be able to have freedom of exporting corn and other products that they grow. They're not as interested in other people being able to export back to us. But in any case, for well over 100 years, American agriculture wanted a government that was oriented toward promoting the ability of American farmers to export beyond their frontier. So that even people who, in their thinking and their assumptions about the way the world worked and other things, weren't necessarily up to date. They weren't reading Foreign Affairs in 1925, but they did have a certain personal tie. I would also add, if you look at American history, the tremendous importance of the missionary movement in keeping people connected. That all over the country you had these grassroots churches that would be supporting their own missionary family that was in China or in Africa or in India or what have you, and they would be getting letters back, fundraising letters and report letters from this family of Americans who went from Alabama and were living in the Congo or wherever it might be. And so you had senses of personal connection. Again, this didn't necessarily translate into a wise, historically literate vision of the world, but what it created in America was a kind of an openness to ideas, and it also made it hard for anybody to impose an integrated anti-openness ideology on the United States. I think isolationism was strongest in this country actually in the 20s and 30s. Because in the past, the British had been doing all the dirty, ugly work in the world, in a sense. And the Americans had been free riders in the British system. As the British lost the ability to run the system or to manage it, Americans sort of got this idea, well, fine, let's just let the world go. We don't need to worry about anything. But what you get, first of all, free trade breaks down, you have a Great Depression. Also some banking regulation problems. Then you get, 10 years later, you've tried to ignore the international security situation, you've got Hitler in Europe. And then after that, you've got Stalin and the Cold War, and you sort of hit the American people over the head with a 2x4 3 times like that. And you developed a consensus which I believe still stands rather strongly in the United States today, that the U.S. cannot remain indifferent to either economic or security issues beyond the oceans. And I don't see us going back to that. And I think whenever you see us doing that, or in a sense, the world is very generous with us in some ways. When we're stupid, they find a way to let us know and to catch our attention. And certainly Osama bin Laden caught our attention that perhaps it was an error to ignore what was happening in Afghanistan at the end of the Cold War, and that there were also some other things we needed to think about. So I think what happens is that when through foolishness and carelessness or political incompetence, all of which is as common in this country as anywhere in the world, if not even perhaps more so, when we land ourselves in a difficult situation, we get our fingers under the hammer, or we burn them on a hot stove, and so we result. So there's a feedback mechanism in the world in some ways that maybe makes us a little better than we might otherwise be.
Let me apologize to Maurice and others for not getting to their questions because we've hit our time limit. Let me say one or two things. We like to say here at the Council that we don't produce widgets, or if we do, ideas are our widgets. And this is a big widget. It's also an optimistic widget. I think at the core of Walter's argument is not simply that the Anglo-American order is a good thing, but it's likely to last for a while. There's a lot of adaptability in it, and what he calls it's fault tolerant, that it allows for mistakes on our part, and it also allows for pushback, that it won't be universally accepted, but it will still prevail for quite a while, even in the absence of that. So this is it's an optimistic book at a time one doesn't come across many optimistic books. Walter, as you know, is the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow in American Foreign Policy, and I think here at the Council, and I think he's shown you why he occupies a chair with a big and illustrious name. The name of the book is God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World. It's published by Knopf, and I hope tonight has persuaded all of you to go out and buy it and read it. Thank you very much.
God and Gold. Walter Russell Mead is author of several books, including Power, Terror, Peace, and War, America's Grand Strategy in a World at Risk. He's a senior fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. For more information on the Council, visit Fellow for the Council on Foreign Relations. Discusses the making of the modern world and the establishment of Britain and America as global powers. His talk from New York City is about an hour.
Welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations and to tonight's meeting to celebrate or discuss, or both, maybe to criticize. Walter Russell Mead's most recent book, title is God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World. My name is Richard Haas. I'm President of the Council on Foreign Relations, and lucky enough to have this opportunity to talk to Walter for a few minutes about his book, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you to ask all the good questions that I wasn't smart enough to ask him. Let me start off with some praise for the book. I think it's only fair to praise people before we... Walter Isaacson calls this a sweeping and compelling book. George Will describes it as scintillating. And Fareed Zakaria calls it fascinating and thought-provoking. And even in the world of hyperbole, that you then had the rise of Nazi Germany as well as fascist Italy and Imperial Japan, and then you had 4 decades of Cold War. So how would one say that the last century was an example of Anglo-American dominance?
Well, one would be the fact, who won all those wars? World War I, World War II. And this is really comparable to the 18th century when the British were building the system. Sometimes people call the period between about 1688 and 1815, the final defeat of Napoleon, the Second 100 Years' War. Because most of the time in that period, the British were fighting the French. And as it happened again in the 18th century, again in the 20th century, the Anglo-Americans win these struggles. So it's not a kind of an effortless supremacy that no one resists, but it's a contested supremacy. And the question is partly, how is it that the British and the Americans were able to do so well?
How is it that the Americans and the British were able to do so well?
It is, you know, a lot of it, again, I think a lot of it has to do with this sea power strategy is superior, and once you've established a global order like this, it's very hard to lose it. So that once the British defeated the French in North America and in Asia in the 7 Years' War, they were able to really set up a way of organizing the world that lasted until the Second World War. And the only, you know, the British could lose to Napoleon over and over again in Europe, but they still had their global position. So once you've established this kind of global system, it takes a kind of a coordinated, simultaneous attack to destroy it. But I think another reason is that precisely because capitalism is the center of the system, the way the system works, that both the British and the Americans stayed on the technological and financial edge, so that they had capabilities, they had technology, they had financial abilities that allowed them to defeat these rivals over this very long period.
You emphasized when I first asked one of the first questions the role of trade. So let me return to that in a slightly different way. How much of this is a voluntary system, and how much of this is essentially a coercive system? What is the balance, if you will, between countries wanting to be a part of it and countries essentially being forced to be a part of this world?
Well, I've used the concept of these. So there's a very creative society that is developing new ways to make products, new ways to think about the world, new ways to finance companies. You then, in a sense, you take that show on the road. You go out there, you trade with the rest of the world, you engage with the rest of the world, and that trade makes you wealthy enough to provide sort of a naval strategy that protects your key sea lanes, that allows you to maintain a balance of strategy, a balance of power in key theaters of the world. You then build this network, this global network of trade and economics and finance, and you invite other countries into the system. And you promote liberal values around the world so that other countries become more capable of succeeding in this system, but also, in a sense, more friendly to it, more useful to it. And that system, a balance of power, trade, global organization, and an open society, has really, that system has been the kind of key feature, I think, of international power relations for the last 300 years.
Let me just challenge it in one area, because it's not obvious to me. If I look at the last century, you had the rise of Imperial Germany early in the century. That is blurbdom. Not bad. Not bad. Let's start with the title, Walter. God and Gold. The last time I heard those two words, it was part of three words: God, Glory, and Gold, and the Crusades. And I assume that having God and Gold in the title was not accidental.
Well, that's right. Because this is really a book about how some religious attitudes and attitudes toward capitalism have helped power the Anglo-Americans to this sort of unique position in world history over the last 300 years.
Well, let's dig down a bit. A lot of this book is about the world that the Anglo-Americans have wrought. Let's talk about the cardinal features of this world. What is this Anglo-American world?
Well, I call it the maritime system in the book, which is to say it's a system that is built on trade, on commerce. We really look at it, what the English and the Americans, and by the way, the Dutch invented this before the British and the Americans put it together. But it's an open society at home that's democratic, that has economic freedom, that is tolerant of religious and various other kinds of unorthodox